I always wanted to be good at something, for as long as I can remember. Not famous, not the best in the world at anything, just competent in a way that felt solid and real. When I bought the Yellow Wilderness Systems Tsunami 145 2 years ago and started learning to read tidal charts and weather patterns, that's what I found. A thing I could actually do well. And I trained for it the way some people train for marathons, not because anyone was watching, but because it mattered to me. The kayak sat on the roof of my Subaru Outback that Friday morning in late October, strapped down with cam buckles I'd checked twice before leaving Savannah. The contract job with the logistics firm had ended the week before. 6 months of work, clean and finished, and my lease on the short-term apartment ran through the end of the month. I had 3 weeks with nothing waiting on the other side of them. No obligations, no schedule, just the kayak and a long weekend and the boat ramp at Harris Neck Wildlife Refuge, which I'd paddled from once before, 2 summers ago. I drove south on US 17 with the windows cracked, cool air coming in, the highway cutting through low country marsh and pine. The drive took about an hour. I didn't listen to music. I just drove. Before I loaded the car that morning, I'd taken a photo of the kayak on the roof and texted it to my older brother Emmett with the caption, "Harris Neck, back Sunday." He sent back a thumbs-up emoji. That was it. That was the last time I talked to anyone before I launched. Casey Freeman had called me 4 weeks before the contract ended. She was in her apartment in Atlanta, and I was in Savannah, and she said she thought we had both known for a while. I didn't disagree. I thought I would feel something decisive when it happened. Relief or grief or anger, something that landed hard and made sense. Instead, I felt a mild, persistent blankness, like I'd misplaced something but couldn't remember what it was. That feeling followed me through the last weeks of the contract and into the start of my unscheduled freedom, and I kept waiting for it to turn into something else. It didn't. At the Harris Neck ramp, I backed the Subaru down to the water and unloaded. The tide was high, around 9:30 in the morning, and I'd checked the chart app on my phone before I left Savannah to make sure I was launching at the right time. The app showed high tide at 9:28, slack water for the next hour, then the ebb starting around 10:30 and pulling southeast through the creeks. I wanted to catch the slack and get out into the sound before the current got strong. I carried the kayak down to the water and set it at the edge of the ramp, then went back for my gear. 2 dry bags, one with food and clothes, one with my tent and sleeping pad, a deck bag with my VHF radio, my compass, a first aid kit, a knife, and a backup battery pack. My Nalgene bottle clipped to the deck rigging, full of filtered water. I was wearing the Garmin Instinct on my left wrist, olive green, a gift I'd bought myself after the contract paid out, and it was already tracking. I loaded everything into the kayak, checked the buckles on my PFD, and pushed off. The plan was loose. 3 days, no itinerary, camping on sandbars or high ground wherever I found it, back at the ramp by Sunday afternoon. I'd done trips like this before, not here, but on other stretches of the coast. I knew what I was doing. I had the right gear, the right training, the right instincts. I was good at this. The first hours were easy. I worked through the tidal creeks east of the refuge, narrow channels cutting through cordgrass that rose higher than my head when I sat in the cockpit. The water was dark and smooth, the grass thick and green, and egrets stood in the shallows watching me pass. The paddling was rhythmic and familiar. I settled into my stroke rate, the one I could hold for hours, and watched the GPS track on my wrist. It showed a clean line running southeast from the ramp. By early afternoon, I'd crossed into the open water of St. Catherine's Sound. The creeks opened up and the horizon got wider, and I could see the tree line of St. Catherine's Island to my left, maybe half a mile off. I worked south along the edge of the island, keeping the trees in sight, and the wind stayed light from the southwest. The water was calm. The sky was clear. Everything was exactly the way it should be. I ate lunch on the water. A peanut butter sandwich from one of the dry bags, The Nalgene refilled from the bottle I'd filtered at the ramp. I checked the Garmin once and saw the track running clean and straight, south-southeast. No drift, no wander. I was satisfied with that. 2 miles south of St. Catherine's Island in the middle of the afternoon, I saw the island. It wasn't on my chart. I'd checked the chart twice before I launched, and I knew this stretch of the sound. There were sandbars and oyster beds marked on the map, a few low hammocks that went underwater at high tide, but nothing like this. This was a real island, low and flat, barely above the waterline, but solid. It was covered in live oaks, old ones, with branches that extended almost horizontally and hung with long curtains of Spanish moss. The roots must have been thick enough to hold the soil together through the tides. At high water, the beach was just a narrow strip of gray mud and oyster shell. I could see a dock at the north end, old, weathered, built from creosote pilings and planks that looked like they'd been repaired 100 times. There were 2 small workboats tied to the dock, and 2 kayaks pulled up on the mud beside it. The mainland was visible to the west, a dark smudge of tree line maybe 2 miles out. The island sat in the middle of the sound like something the tide forgot. I turned my bow toward it. I paddled toward the island because I was curious. That was all. The afternoon was long, and I had nowhere to be, and the island sat there in the middle of the sound like something forgotten by the tide. Up close, it was maybe a 1/4 mile across at its widest, low and flat, barely above the waterline. The beach at high water was a narrow strip of gray mud and oyster shell. Live oaks covered most of the island, old enough that their roots had knitted the soil into something that held against the tides. The branches extended almost horizontally, hung with long curtains of Spanish moss that swayed in the light wind. A dock extended from the island's north end, old, weathered, built from creosote pilings and planks that had been repaired so many times the original wood was indistinguishable from the patches. 2 small workboats were tied to it. 2 kayaks were pulled up on the mud beside it. The mainland was a dark smudge of tree line to the west, close enough to see, far enough that I estimated it at 2 miles. I pulled the chart from my deck bag and unfolded it across my spray skirt, holding it flat with one hand while the kayak drifted. The island wasn't on it. I checked the coordinates on my watch. I was where I thought I was, south of St. Catherine's, in the middle of the sound. But the island wasn't marked. I folded the chart and put it away. Maybe it was too small to chart. Maybe it was privately owned and whoever owned it didn't want it listed. I didn't know, and it didn't seem like the kind of thing that mattered. The island was right in front of me. The dock was real. The boats were real. I paddled toward it. Before my kayak had fully touched the dock, a man came down the path from the tree line to meet me. He was mid-50s, lean and sun-darkened, with a gray beard trimmed close and hands that were heavily calloused from real outdoor work. He wore rubber boots and a canvas work shirt, and moved with the unhurried ease of someone who hadn't been in a hurry for years. His first words to me were, "That's a good color for visibility out here, the yellow." I hadn't said anything about my kayak's color. I registered that for maybe half a second and then filed it away as the kind of thing a person with years of experience on the water would simply observe. The kayak was right in front of him. The kayak was yellow. Of course he could see it. "Thanks," I said, reaching for the dock with my paddle to steady myself. I didn't see this island on my chart. "It's called Drum Key," he said, crouching at the edge of the dock and holding out a hand to help me tie up. "Not a lot of people know about it. We keep it that way." I looped the bowline around a cleat and secured it with a bowline knot. My hands did it automatically. I'd tied that knot 1,000 times. "You live here?" I asked. "Yeah, 19 of us. We came out about 7 years ago, a loose group from various places. We wanted to live closer to the water and further from everything else." He said it plainly, without any recruitment in his voice. He wasn't trying to sell me on anything. He was just stating a fact. I climbed out of the kayak onto the dock, my legs stiff from the hours of paddling. The dock swayed slightly under my weight, and I steadied myself on one of the pilings. The wood was rough and warm from the sun. "We fish," he continued, standing up and brushing his hands on his pants. "Grow vegetables in raised beds behind the main structures. Catch rainwater. It's not a religious thing, not a political thing. Just people who wanted a different kind of life and found a piece of ground that suited it." He paused, looking out at the water for a moment, then back at me. "You want to stay for dinner? Camp on the island for the night? There's good ground under the oaks and we've got plenty of food." The offer was so ordinary that declining it would have required a reason I didn't have. The afternoon sun was already slanting lower in the sky. The tide would turn soon. I had no fixed destination, no schedule to keep. I'd been planning to find a sandbar somewhere to camp on, but this was better. Solid ground, other people, a meal I didn't have to cook myself. "Yeah," I said. "That'd be great. Thank you." "I'm Felix," he said, holding out his hand. "Drew." We shook. His grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of someone who worked with his hands every day. He led me up the path from the dock into the camp. The path was narrow, winding between the oaks, and the Spanish moss hung low enough that I had to duck under it in places. The air was cooler under the trees, out of the direct sun, and smelled like salt water and damp soil and wood smoke. The camp was a cluster of structures built from salvaged materials. There was a main hall that looked like it had started life as a fishing shack and been expanded over the years. A covered porch ran along one side, and an outdoor kitchen had been built onto the back. Two smaller sleeping structures stood off to the left. A tool shed, a series of canvas and wood frame shelters built under the oaks by individual members, each one slightly different from the others. On the south side of the main hall, I could see a solar panel array tilted toward the sun, and through the open door of the shed I glimpsed a battery bank, a radio, and a chest freezer. The whole setup was functional and unglamorous. It looked like the kind of place people lived because they wanted to, not because they were trying to prove something. A woman came out onto the porch of the main hall as we approached. She was somewhere in her 40s with short hair streaked gray and a direct way of moving. She wore an apron over work clothes and was wiping her hands on a towel. "Sarah," Felix called. "We've got a guest for the night. Drew, this is Sarah. She's the cook." "Good timing," Sarah said. She didn't ask if I wanted to stay. She just nodded, like my presence had already been accounted for. "Dinner's in a couple hours. You need anything in the meantime?" "I'm good," I said. "Just need a spot to pitch my tent." A younger man came down from the porch, 20-something, with sun-bleached hair and the easy physicality of someone who'd done outdoor labor since he was young. He wore worn work clothes and moved quickly, like he was used to being helpful. "I'll give you a hand with those bags," he said, nodding at my kayak down at the dock. "I'm Ernest." "Drew." We walked back down to the dock together and I pulled my dry bags out of the kayak, along with my tent and sleeping pad. Ernest carried 2 of the bags without being asked, and I shouldered the rest. He led me to a flat piece of ground under a wide oak, maybe 50 yards from the main hall, where the roots had leveled out and the ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. "This is a good spot," he said, setting the bags down. "Flat, and the tree'll keep you dry if it rains." "Thanks." He left me to it and I pitched the tent myself. The routine was familiar. Spread the footprint, snap the poles together, thread them through the sleeves, stake out the corners. My hands knew the order. I didn't have to think about it. The tent went up in less than 10 minutes, and I tossed my sleeping bag and pad inside, along with the dry bags. By the time I finished, the light had shifted to the long gold slant of late afternoon. I could hear voices from the main hall, people talking, the scrape of a chair, the clang of something metal. I walked over. The porch was wide and shaded, with a long table built from planks and sawhorses. A few people were sitting there already. Sarah was at the outdoor kitchen, tending a grill where fish were sizzling over coals. The smell was incredible. Charred skin and wood smoke and something herbal I couldn't place. Felix was at the table and he waved me over. I sat down across from him. Ernest came out of the main hall with a pitcher of water and started filling cups. A couple came down the path from the garden area, a man and a woman, both somewhere in their 40s, with dirt on their hands and the sturdy, practical look of people who work the soil for a living. "Drew, this is Axel and Janet," Felix said. "They run the garden beds." "Nice to meet you," Axel said, nodding. Janet smiled but didn't say anything. They sat down at the far end of the table. An older man came out of the tool shed, wiping his hands on a rag. He was lean and weathered, with a face creased from years of sun. He nodded at me and sat down without introduction. Ernest leaned over and said quietly, "That's Jaden. He maintains the boats." A woman in her 30s was sitting on the edge of the porch reading a paperback. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and an intense, focused look. She glanced up when I sat down, made brief eye contact, and went back to her book. Ernest didn't bother introducing her, and I didn't ask. Sarah brought the fish over on a platter, whole grilled snapper, skin crispy and blackened in places. She set it down in the middle of the table along with a pot of rice and a bowl of collard greens. Then she served me a portion without asking if I wanted one. Just scooped fish and rice and greens onto a plate and set it in front of me. "Thanks," I said. "Sure." The conversation around the table was easy. People asked where I'd come from, what I did for work, how long I'd been kayaking. I told them about the contract job in Savannah, the 6 months of logistics software that had just wrapped up. I told them about the kayak trip, the loose plan to paddle south for a few days and camp wherever I found good ground. I didn't mention Casey. Nobody asked about a partner, and I didn't volunteer the information. It felt good not to talk about it. The food was simple and excellent. The fish was fresh, probably caught that morning. The collard greens had a smoky, slightly bitter taste that went well with the rice. I ate 2 plates and drank 3 cups of water, and by the time Sarah brought out a pot of coffee, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. The sun set while we were sitting there, and the sky over the water went through shades of orange and pink and finally deep blue. Someone lit a lantern and hung it from a hook on the porch beam. The conversation drifted. Talk about the garden beds, the crab pots that needed checking, the weather forecast for the next few days. Nobody asked me what my plans were. Nobody tried to recruit me into anything. It was just people talking about their day, and I was part of it for the evening. I stayed on the porch until the coffee was gone and people started drifting off to their shelters. Ernest said goodnight. Axel and Janet walked back toward the garden area. Jaden went into the tool shed and came out a minute later with a toolbox, heading down toward the dock. The woman with the paperback closed her book and went inside the main hall without a word. Felix stood up and stretched. "You need anything else tonight?" he asked. "No, I'm good. Thanks for dinner." "Sure. Sleep well." He walked off toward one of the smaller sleeping structures, and I headed back to my tent. The island was quiet except for the sound of the water against the shore and the occasional call of a night bird in the trees. The air had cooled, and the Spanish moss hung still in the darkness. I unzipped the tent and crawled inside. My sleeping bag was where I'd left it, spread out on the pad. I pulled off my boots and socks and set them by the door, then lay down fully clothed. I was tired in a good way, the kind of tired that comes from a long day of physical work and good food and being outside. I thought I'd lie awake for a while, the way I usually did, turning over the day in my head. But I didn't. I closed my eyes and was asleep almost immediately. I woke before dawn, with the gray pre-sunrise light filtering through the tent fabric. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I remembered. The island, the camp, the dinner on the porch. I sat up and rubbed my face. Something felt off. I looked around the tent. My dry bags were unpacked. The food canister was gone. I crawled to the tent door and unzipped it, looking out. The food canister was hanging from a rope in the oak above the tent. It was properly bear-bagged, suspended 10 feet off the ground, 6 feet from the trunk. Exactly the way I would have done it myself if I'd been thinking about bears. But I hadn't been thinking about bears. There weren't bears on a tidal island in coastal Georgia, and I didn't remember unpacking the bags. I didn't remember hanging the canister. My Nalgene bottle was sitting by the tent door, right outside the flap. I picked it up. It was full. I unscrewed the cap and sniffed. The water smelled clean, filtered. I didn't remember filling it. I stared at the bottle for a long moment. Then I looked back at the unpacked bags, the hanging food canister, the tent organized in a way that was efficient and competent, and exactly how I would have done it if I'd been fully awake. I must have done it on autopilot, I thought, before I crashed. I was exhausted. I must have unpacked, hung the food, filled the bottle, and then passed out without remembering any of it. It was the kind of thing that happens sometimes. You drive a familiar route and don't remember the turns. You go through the motions and your brain doesn't bother recording it. That had to be it. I screwed the cap back on the Nalgene and set it down. Then I lay back in the tent and stared at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to come up. I stood at the door of the tent staring at the dry bags. They were unpacked. The food canister was hanging from a rope in the oak above the tent, properly bear-bagged the way I would have done it myself. The Nalgene was sitting by the door, full, and the water in it was filtered. I had no memory of doing any of this. I tried to piece it together. I remembered pitching the tent in the fading afternoon light. I remembered dinner on the porch. After that, things got fuzzy. I had a vague sense of having been very tired when I went to sleep. The kind of tired where you're moving on autopilot, doing things without registering them. Like driving a familiar route and arriving at your destination with no conscious memory of the turns you made along the way. That must have been it, I decided. I'd unpacked the bags and hung the food and filtered the water before crashing, and I just didn't remember doing it. I reached for the Nalgene out of habit to refill it before the day started, then stopped when I realized it was already full. I put it back. The morning was pleasant. Jaden Schneider found me on the porch after breakfast and asked if I wanted to help check the crab pots. I agreed. We took one of the workboats around the island's south end. The water was brown and flat, and the marsh grass on the distant shore was gold in the October light. The boat was an old aluminum skiff with a small outboard motor that sounded like it had been running for 20 years without complaint. Jaden drove, standing up, one hand on the tiller, his eyes on the water ahead. The work was physical and satisfying in a way I'd missed. We hauled the wire traps up from the bottom, sorted the catch, rebaited the pots with fish heads from a bucket, and dropped them back over the side. Jaden was quiet company, efficient, not unfriendly, just not the sort of person who felt the need to fill silence with conversation. He knew every pot's position without checking a chart or looking at a GPS. He'd point at a spot in the water that looked like every other spot and say, "There," and the trap would come up exactly where he said it would be. I liked that. I liked working with someone who knew what they were doing and didn't need to talk about it. In the afternoon, I sat on the dock with my feet over the edge, watching the tide drop. The water was moving out fast now, exposing the mud flats on the island's western side. The smell of salt and marsh mud was strong. A heron worked the shallows near the bank, stepping carefully through the exposed oyster beds. Ernest Bennett came and sat with me after a while. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down and let his legs hang over the edge the way mine did. We stayed like that for a few minutes, watching the heron. Eventually we talked about nothing in particular. The weather coming in from the southwest, the way the sound changed color at different tides. He asked how long I'd been kayaking, and I told him 2 years, which seemed like a reasonable answer even though I couldn't remember if I'd already told him that at dinner the night before. At one point, Ernest said without particular emphasis, "The North Point approach is the one most people use the second time they come in. The current sets that way in the afternoon." I nodded. I'd come in from the north that first afternoon. The current had been with me, pushing me along the island's eastern side. I assumed he was making conversation about the island's approach angles, the kind of local knowledge a person accumulates after spending enough time in one place. Fishermen and sailors always had this sort of information filed away. Which channel to take at high tide, which sandbar to avoid at low water, which approach the current favored. I didn't ask what he meant by the second time. It didn't occur to me to ask. Saturday evening after dinner, I sat on the porch with my Garmin watch in my hand. Jaden had offered me the cable to charge it from the solar bank, and I'd accepted. The watch battery was down to 20%, which was lower than I liked to let it get. I plugged it in, and while it was charging, I glanced at the track history screen. I liked looking at my tracks. It was satisfying to see the clean lines of a route well executed, the way a route should look when you know what you're doing. Today's track was there, as expected. A short loop around the island's south end for the crab pot run, then a stationary dot at the dock where I'd spent the afternoon sitting with Ernest. Under today's recorded movement, there was another line, faint, thin, and slightly translucent, the way a ghost track looks when a GPS device has a calibration artifact or a corrupted segment. It ran the same inbound approach route from the northeast that I'd paddled on Friday afternoon. The same line, the same curve around the island's north point. The timestamp was from 3 days ago. I stared at the screen. 3 days ago, I was in Savannah. I was loading the kayak onto the roof of the Subaru in the parking lot of my short-term apartment. I hadn't even left the city yet. I turned the watch over in my hand, looking at the back of it where the serial number was printed in tiny letters. I'd bought the watch used off a guy on Craigslist 6 months ago. He'd said it was in good condition, barely used, and I'd checked it over before buying it. The watch had worked fine ever since. No issues, no glitches. But GPS devices did this sometimes. They kept old data in the memory even after a factory reset. Corrupted segments that didn't fully delete. Ghost tracks from previous owners that overlapped with new routes by coincidence. That had to be it. The previous owner must have paddled this same route at some point. Maybe they'd been out here on a trip of their own. Maybe they'd come to this island too. It wasn't that strange. The Georgia coast wasn't that big. People paddled the same routes all the time. The fact that the track overlapped perfectly with mine was just coincidence. A calibration artifact. Something in the watch's memory that hadn't been fully wiped. I plugged the watch into the solar bank cable and went to bed. I woke up before dawn on Sunday with the decision already made. I was leaving. Not because anything was wrong. The people were fine. The island was fine. Felix had been welcoming in his quiet way, and Sarah had fed me well, and Ernest had shown me where to pitch my tent without making me feel like I owed him anything for it. They were all perfectly nice, and the island itself was beautiful in that low, windswept way coastal islands are when they've been here long enough that the trees grow sideways and the oyster shells stack up in ridges along the waterline. But I'd been here 2 nights, and I had that low, itchy feeling you get when you've stayed somewhere comfortable slightly longer than you intended to. Like you're going to wear out your welcome if you don't leave soon, even if nobody's actually told you to go. I'd checked the tide chart app on my phone the night before. Low tide was at 6 in the morning, which meant the mud flats on the island's west side would be exposed, and I could paddle the shallow route back toward the Harris Neck channels without fighting the full current. The chart confirmed it. The window was there. All I had to do was use it. I packed my tent and bags quietly in the dark, working by feel more than sight. The sky was still black overhead, with just the faintest pale edge starting to show in the east. I rolled the tent up tight and stuffed it into the dry bag, then carried everything down the path to the dock in 2 trips. My boots made almost no sound on the packed dirt. The camp was silent behind me. Nobody stirred. Loading the kayak took maybe 5 minutes. I worked quickly, clipping the bags into place, checking the deck lines, making sure the paddle was secure. I did not go back up the path to say goodbye. I thought about it for half a second, but it was barely past 5:30 in the morning and nobody was awake, and waking them just to announce I was leaving felt like more of an imposition than slipping out quietly. I told myself I'd send Felix a message later once I had cell service again. Thank him for the hospitality. Tell him it was a nice place. I felt a small, mild guilt about leaving without a word, but it was the kind of guilt I knew would evaporate in an hour, once I was a mile offshore and the island was just a low smudge behind me. I pushed off the dock at 5:50. The water was flat and dark, the kind of pre-dawn stillness that makes every paddle stroke sound louder than it should. The sky overhead had gone from black to that dull gray color, like old pewter, and the air was cool enough that I could see my breath for the first few strokes. I settled into the cockpit, adjusted my spray skirt, and turned the bow west. The mainland tree line was visible the moment I cleared the island's north end. It sat there on the horizon like a dark horizontal line, maybe 2 miles out, exactly where it was supposed to be. I'd checked the compass bearing the night before on my phone, 270 degrees, due west, straight to the Harris Neck channels. I set the bearing on the compass mounted to my deck bag, checked it twice to make sure, and began the crossing. The water was calm, almost no chop at all, just the faintest ripple from the southwest wind that had been blowing all weekend. My paddle was smooth in my hands, and I settled into my stroke rate without thinking about it, the rhythm I could hold for hours if I needed to. I'd done longer crossings than this. 2 miles was nothing. I watched the mainland and paddled. It felt good to be moving again, to be doing something. The island had been fine, but sitting still for 2 days had left me restless, in a way I hadn't realized until I was back in the kayak with a destination in front of me. This was what I was good at. This was what I knew how to do. Navigate. Move. Get from one place to another without getting lost. I kept my eyes on the tree line and paddled. I watched the mainland for 2 hours. I didn't check my watch. I didn't need to. I could feel the time passing in my arms, in the rhythm of the paddle, in the way the light changed overhead as the sun finally broke the horizon behind me and turned the sky from gray to pale yellow. The tree line stayed where it was, a dark smudge on the water, and I kept paddling toward it. My stroke didn't falter. My bearing didn't drift. I was doing everything right. I was still watching the tree line when my bow scraped something solid. The sound was loud in the stillness, a rough, grinding scrape of fiberglass against wood, and I felt the kayak slow and stop. I looked down at the water, confused, because there wasn't supposed to be anything out here. No sandbars, no pilings, nothing but open water for 2 miles in every direction. I looked forward. The dock was right in front of me, the dock at Drum Key's north end. The same creosote pilings, weathered and dark, with the same patches of barnacles crusted along the waterline. The same planks, some newer than others, nailed down over the older wood in a patchwork that I recognized because I'd tied up to it 2 days ago when I first arrived. My kayak was nosing against it from the outside. The yellow bow nudged up against the dock's edge the same way it had been on Friday afternoon. I sat in the kayak for a full minute without moving. My hands were still on the paddle. My feet were still braced against the foot pegs. The spray skirt was still tight around my waist. I hadn't stopped paddling. I hadn't turned around. I'd been watching the mainland the entire time, keeping my bearing, doing everything the way I always did it, and somehow I was back at the island. I looked at the Garmin watch on my left wrist. The screen showed the GPS track for this morning, a thin blue line leaving the island's north end, heading west, exactly the way I'd paddled it. The line curved west for maybe half a mile, and then it didn't stop. It didn't end. It just curved, arced gradually north, then northeast, then east, in a long, smooth loop that came back around the island's north point and ended at the dock. The total time elapsed was 2 hours and 4 minutes. The total distance was 4.2 miles, consistent with 2 miles out and 2 miles back. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't turned around. The track showed a continuous line, no gaps, no breaks, just a smooth curve that brought me back to the same place I'd started. I'd paddled a perfect loop without making a single conscious decision to turn. I stared at the screen. My hands were shaking. Underneath this morning's track, faint and translucent, was the ghost track I'd seen last night when I was charging the watch. The one I'd assumed was corrupted data from the previous owner. The one that didn't make sense because the timestamp said it was from 3 days ago, when I was still in Savannah. The ghost track was the same line, same curve, same arc, same North Point return. I sat motionless in the yellow kayak at the dock, staring at the Garmin screen showing 2 identical tracks, this morning's loop and the ghost track beneath it, laid over each other like a tracing. Felix was standing on the dock when I touched the pilings. He had a mug of coffee in one hand, steam rising from it in the cool morning air, and he was looking at me like someone watching a bus arrive exactly on schedule. No surprise on his face, no concern. Just that same easy calm I'd seen when I first paddled up on Friday afternoon. Friday. I thought it was Friday. I was pretty sure it had been Friday. He took a sip of the coffee and said, "You always come back around the North Point. You should try the South next time." He said it the way you'd tell someone the grocery store closes at 9. Just a fact, something he'd observed enough times to know it was reliable. I sat in the kayak with my paddle across my lap and tried to make sense of that sentence. You always come back. Always. Not this time, or just now, but always. Like there was a pattern. Like he'd watched it happen before. "How many times?" I asked. My voice came out flat and strange. "How many times have I done this?" Felix looked at me for a moment, and I thought maybe he was deciding whether to answer. But then he shook his head, not in a no, just in a slow sort of way that suggested the question itself didn't matter. "I don't think counting helps," he said. He took another sip of coffee, unhurried, like we had all the time in the world. "The island has a way with people who know how to navigate," he said. "That's all." Then he turned and walked back up the path toward the camp, his boots making soft sounds on the packed dirt. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for me to say anything. He just finished his coffee and left. I sat there with the kayak bobbing gently against the dock. My hands had already tied the bowline to the cleat. I didn't remember doing it, but the knot was there. A clean bowline, exactly the way I always tied it. My hands had gone through the motions without asking my brain for permission. I looked down at the Garmin watch on my wrist. The screen was still showing the GPS track from this morning's paddle. A smooth arc leaving the island's north end, curving west, then gradually bending north, then northeast, then east, coming back around to the same dock I'd left from 2 hours ago. The line didn't stop anywhere. It didn't turn around. It just curved, like I'd been paddling in a giant circle the whole time, and my brain had convinced itself I was going west toward the mainland. Underneath that line, the ghost track was still visible. Same curve, same arc, same return to the North Point. The timestamp said it was from 3 days ago, which was impossible, because 3 days ago I was loading the kayak onto my car in Savannah. I looked at the mud. The tide was at its lowest now. The water pulled back to expose the gray flat at the base of the island's bank. The mud was soft and smooth, marked by the ridges the water left behind when it dropped. And across it, leading up from the waterline toward the path and the oaks, I could see boot prints. 3 sets of them. All of them running the same direction, from the water up to the camp. All of them the same tread pattern, the same size, the same stride length. I lifted my foot off the kayak's footrest and looked at the bottom of my boot. Vibram sole, lug pattern in a zigzag, a small nick on the right heel where I'd caught it on a rock 2 months ago. I looked back at the prints in the mud, same zigzag, same nick, same slightly wider spacing on the right foot, the gait I'd had ever since I sprained my ankle on the Appalachian Trail when I was 23. 3 arrivals. 3 times I'd stepped out of the kayak onto this bank and walked up that path. 3 times I'd tied up at this dock and carried my gear up to camp and sat down to dinner and gone to sleep in my tent under the oaks. I had no memory of the first 2. I tried to think back to Friday, to the moment I'd first paddled up to this island. I could remember tying the kayak to the dock. I could remember Felix coming down the path to meet me. I could remember him saying that thing about the yellow kayak being good for visibility. But before that, before I spotted the island from 2 miles out, nothing. Just the memory of launching from Harris Neck and paddling through the tidal creeks and crossing into open water. The rest of Friday was blank, like someone had taken an eraser to it. And before that, before Friday, I had no idea. From up the path, Sarah's voice carried down through the oaks. She was calling my name. Not yelling, not asking if anyone was there, just calling. "Drew," she said, easy and clear, like she was reminding me I had somewhere to be. The dinner bell rang once, a cast-iron clang that echoed across the water and faded into the trees. Then her voice again. "Breakfast is ready." I sat in the kayak with my paddle across my knees, looking from the ghost track on the Garmin screen to the 3 sets of my own boot prints drying in the mud. The sun was fully up now, warm on my shoulders, and the Spanish moss hung from the oaks above the path, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Sarah's voice and the bell carried down through it, easy and unhurried, like this was just another Sunday morning, and I was just another guest who'd slept in a little late. I sat in the cockpit with the paddle across my knees and worked through what I knew. I was an excellent navigator. I read tidal charts. I carried a compass. I knew these waters. The southwest wind had been blowing consistently since Friday afternoon when I first approached the island. The flooding tide set northeast in the afternoon, the way it always did in this part of the Sound. A skilled paddler crossing 2 miles of open water with a consistent wind and a set current would automatically correct for drift. That was basic navigation, the kind of thing you did without thinking once you had enough experience. You felt the wind pushing you, you compensated with your stroke angle, you checked your bearing against a fixed point on the horizon, and you adjusted. And in correcting for drift on this particular piece of water, with this particular wind and this particular tide, a skilled paddler would always produce the same efficient inbound route. The North Point approach. The one that accounted for current. The one a skilled paddler would choose. The one I had chosen 3 times now, apparently, without remembering the first 2. I understood it now, sitting at the dock of an island that wasn't on any chart. The island didn't pull people back with force or ritual or malice. It reflected. A person who didn't know how to navigate would wander and land somewhere random and might not return. But a person who knew exactly how to navigate, the kind of person who checked tidal charts before launching, who carried a handheld VHF radio and a compass alongside their phone, who was proud of their competence in a quiet, private way, would follow their own most reliable instincts. And on this water, with this wind and this tide, those instincts would always produce the same loop. The better I was, the more perfectly I came back. My competence was the closed loop. My pride in my own skill was the thing that wouldn't let me leave. I thought about Emmett and the thumbs up emoji. I thought about the Sunday afternoon I'd told him I'd be back by. I didn't know what Sunday it was. Whether this was the Sunday I meant, or a later one, or how many times the loop had run before the memory of it failed to hold. The Garmin watch showed 2 ghost tracks underneath this morning's route, but there could have been more that the device had overwritten. I had no way of knowing. The mud on the island's bank showed 3 sets of boot prints with my tread pattern and my gait, but the tide came in twice a day and wiped the bank clean, so those 3 arrivals could have been the most recent 3 out of a dozen, or more. I considered my options. I could try the south approach. Felix had said so. Leave around the south point instead of the north, take a different angle on the crossing, account for a different set of currents. But trying the south approach was still navigating. It was still applying skill to a problem. It was still being the person who knew how to read water. The island would still be reflecting that person back at itself. A different route was still a route chosen by someone who knew how to choose routes. I could also push off the dock right now, point myself at nothing in particular, and paddle badly on purpose. Not check the compass. Not correct for drift. Not aim for a fixed point on the horizon. Just go. I had never done that in my adult life. I didn't know what it would mean to leave badly. I wasn't sure I knew how. I had built my identity around knowing exactly where I was going. The idea of deliberately abandoning that wasn't just uncomfortable. It was nearly illegible to me as an action I could take. Paddling without checking the compass felt like walking down a staircase in the dark without holding the railing. It felt reckless. It felt wrong. It felt like the kind of thing someone who didn't know what they were doing would do, and I wasn't that person. I had never been that person. Sarah called my name again from up the path, the 3rd time this morning. The bell rang again, a single cast iron clang that echoed down through the oaks. The smell of wood smoke and coffee drifted down through the Spanish moss. The morning was very quiet except for the small sound of water against the dock pilings, a rhythmic slap and hiss that I had been hearing for 3 days now without consciously noticing it until this moment. I looked at the mainland. It was a dark smudge on the horizon, 2 miles away, the same distance it was 2 hours ago when I was paddling directly toward it. The same distance it had been on Friday afternoon when I first spotted the island and thought it looked interesting. The same distance it would be if I pushed off the dock right now and tried again. I looked at the mainland smudge, 2 miles away, the same distance it had always been, and understood that my entire life of careful navigation had made me perfectly, precisely unable to leave. I looked at the compass mounted to my deck bag, the kind that clips into a bracket so you can read it without taking your hands off the paddle. I'd bought it 2 years ago from a marine supply store in Brunswick and mounted it myself. The needle was steady, pointing north the way it always did, the way it was supposed to. I looked at the Garmin watch on my wrist, the olive green case scratched from 2 years of use. The screen showed the track history, both lines, the loop I'd paddled this morning, and the ghost track underneath it from a time I didn't remember. I looked at the mainland, the dark smudge of tree line sitting on the horizon, 2 miles out, the same distance it had been when I started. I made a decision. I reached down and unclipped the compass from its bracket. The plastic mounting released with a small click. I didn't throw it overboard. I didn't discard it. I just lifted it out of the bracket and set it loose in my lap, where it sat against the spray skirt, the needle still pointing north, still working perfectly, just not where my eyes would find it automatically anymore. I did not check the Garmin track. I did not open the tide chart app on my phone. I did not calculate the wind angle or the current set or the bearing I should take to compensate for drift. These were things I did not do. The not doing of them was the most deliberate act of my adult life. I pushed off the dock. Sarah's voice was still carrying down through the oaks behind me, calling my name, telling me breakfast was ready. I did not turn around. I dipped the paddle and pulled, and the yellow kayak moved forward into open water. I pointed the bow at a gap in the light on the water. Not the mainland, not a bearing, just a direction that was roughly west and slightly wrong. The kind of line a person who wasn't thinking about current would pick. The kind of line I would have corrected immediately, 2 hours ago, 3 days ago, Every other time I'd been on the water. I began to paddle. The first minutes were disorienting in a way that was almost physical. Every instinct I had was registering the drift, the southwest wind pushing me north, the flooding tide setting me northeast. Every instinct was producing a correction impulse, a small adjustment to the paddle angle, a slight shift in the bow direction, and every instinct was something I refused to act on. I paddled through the corrections without making them. The bow wandered. I let it wander. I focused on the stroke rate and nothing else. The mechanical rhythm of the blade entering the water, pulling, exiting, left side, right side, left side, right side. I did not look at where the bow was pointing. The sound opened around me. The island fell behind. I did not look back. I paddled through a wide, wandering arc. Not the clean, efficient curve of a skilled navigator correcting for drift, but the irregular, wobbling line of someone who was lost, or pretending to be lost, or learning for the first time what it felt like to not know exactly where they were going. The compass sat loose in my lap, the needle steady, pointing north. The Garmin watch was recording a track I couldn't read without looking at it, and I did not look at it. The water was flat and brown-green and empty. The wind was light. The paddle pulled through the water the way it always did, the same resistance, the same sound, but the rhythm was wrong. I was drifting. I could feel it. The current setting me northeast, the wind pushing me north, the bow wandering in a way that would have driven me crazy 10 minutes ago. I kept paddling. I did not correct. I focused on the stroke and nothing else, and tried not to think about where I was going. It felt like being drunk, like trying to walk a straight line with your eyes closed, like every part of my body was screaming at me to fix something that was wrong, and I was refusing to listen. I paddled for what felt like an hour, maybe longer. I didn't check the watch. The cordgrass appeared ahead of me, not suddenly, but gradually, the way things appear when you're not watching for them. The edge of the Harris Neck Marsh, the shallow mud flats on the western side of the sound, tall green stalks rising out of the water, dense and tangled, and behind them the low dark line of the refuge tree line. My bow pushed into the cordgrass and kept going, the stalks bending and then snapping, and then the kayak stopped. The bow was buried in the grass. The hull was grounded on the mud flat underneath. I sat upright in the cockpit, the paddle across my knees, the cordgrass pressing against both sides of the bow. I was not at the ramp. I was somewhere along the western edge of the marsh. I didn't know where. I didn't know which creek mouth this was, or how far north or south of the ramp I'd drifted, or what the GPS track looked like. I had never not known exactly where I was. The feeling was vertiginous. My hands were shaking. I looked down at the compass sitting loose in my lap, the needle pointing north, and then I looked up at the cordgrass and the tree line beyond it, and I realized I didn't know precisely where I was for the first time in my adult life. And underneath the vertigo, underneath the disorientation, there was something else. Something that wasn't relief, but was adjacent to it. Something small and bright and terrifying. I sat upright in the grounded yellow kayak, bow buried in cordgrass on the mud flat, the deck compass loose in my lap, not knowing precisely where I was for the first time in my adult life. I sat in the grounded kayak in the cordgrass and didn't move for a while. The sun was fully up. The marsh smelled of salt and pluff mud, thick and organic, the smell of things decomposing and renewing at the same time. My bow was buried in the grass, and I could hear the small sound of water moving through the stems, the tide beginning to flood again. I looked at the Garmin watch for the first time since I'd pushed off the dock. The track on the screen showed 3 wide, irregular arcs, not the clean, efficient loop of the North Point return, but a wandering, wobbling line that crossed itself twice and terminated here in the cordgrass, somewhere along the western edge of the Harris Neck Marsh. I had never produced a track that looked like this in my life. It looked like the track of someone who did not know where they were going. It looked like the track of someone who was lost. I stared at it for a long time, watching the thin green line on the screen, and felt nothing except a kind of distant curiosity about the person who had paddled that route. I looked back east across the Sound. Drum Key was not visible from here. The angle was wrong, or the distance was too great, or the low profile of the island had dropped below the waterline of my perspective. The Sound was open and flat and empty, just water and light in the haze of distance where the mainland curved south. I thought about the 3 sets of boot prints in the mud. I thought about Ernest Bennett saying the second time without explaining it, his voice easy and conversational, the way you mention something everyone already knows. I thought about Felix finishing his coffee and walking back up the path without waiting for an answer, the way a person walks away from something they have seen resolve itself before. A Georgia DNR patrol boat running the Sapelo Sound Channel spotted the yellow kayak grounded in the cordgrass and altered course toward it. I heard the engine change pitch before I saw the boat, the sound dropping as the officer throttled down and came in slowly, reading the shallow water carefully. The boat was white with a green stripe along the hull and the DNR logo on the side. The officer at the helm was older, maybe 50, with a ball cap and sunglasses and the relaxed posture of someone who had been running these channels for years. He called out to me, "You all right out there? You need assistance?" I looked up at the patrol boat and said, "I'm all right. I got turned around." The officer looked at the kayak, the grounded bow, the compass loose in my lap where I had set it after realizing I didn't need it anymore. He nodded, the way a person nods at something they have seen before. "Harris Neck Ramp's about 1.5 miles north," he said. "Current's running your way if you push off now." "Thank you," I said. The patrol boat idled nearby while I worked the kayak free of the cordgrass. I pushed with the paddle against the mud, felt the bow lift and slide backward, and then I was floating again. The officer gave me a small wave and throttled up, turning back toward the channel. I watched him go, the wake spreading out behind the boat in 2 clean lines, and then I turned north and began to paddle. I followed the edge of the marsh. I did not check the compass. I followed the tree line, the way a person who is not thinking about navigation follows a shoreline, not because it is the optimal route, but because it is there and it is going the right direction, and that is enough. The paddle felt light in my hands. My stroke was uneven, not the metronomic rhythm I usually held for hours, but something looser, less deliberate. The ramp appeared ahead of me after maybe 20 minutes, the concrete slope and the parking area, my Subaru Outback sitting in the lot with the kayak rack on the roof. I ran the bow up the ramp and felt it scrape against the concrete. I sat in the kayak on the ramp for a moment before getting out. I took the Garmin watch off my wrist and looked at the full track record, scrolling back through the history. The clean line south from Friday's launch. The loop of the North Point return recorded this morning. And beneath it, the ghost track from 3 days before I ever left Savannah, running the same arc, the same efficient curve back to the island. And then, newest, the wandering 3-arc line that ended here. I did not delete any of it. I put the watch in the dry bag and zipped it shut. I pulled out my phone. I had a signal. 4 bars. I opened my texts and found Emmett's thumbs up emoji from Friday morning, sitting there at the top of the thread like a small piece of evidence from another life. I typed, "Back at the ramp. Everything fine." I did not send it yet. I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about what I would say if Emmett asked how it went. Not the loop, not Drum Key, not Felix's coffee mug, but the actual shape of the weekend. I thought I would say I got turned around. I thought that was accurate. I sent the text. I got out of the kayak. The parking lot was empty except for my car. The air was warm and still, the kind of stillness that comes in late October when the weather has not yet decided to turn cold. I pulled the kayak up the ramp and carried it to the car, heaved it onto the roof rack, and strapped it down. My hands moved through the motions without thinking. I had done this so many times before that my body knew the sequence better than my mind did. I tightened the straps and checked them twice, the way I always did. And then I stood there beside the car with my phone in my hand, waiting for Emmett's reply. It didn't come yet. I looked east across the sound at the flat open water. From here, the horizon was a single, unbroken line, gray-blue water meeting pale sky, and there was nothing between me and that line except distance. No island, no dock, no creosote pilings or patched planks or Spanish moss hanging from the oaks. Drum Key was not visible from here. I did not know whether that meant it was gone, or only that I was no longer the kind of navigator who would find it. The phone buzzed in my hand. Emmett's reply, "Glad you're safe. See you soon." I stood on the Harris Neck boat ramp beside the yellow kayak, phone in hand, and looked out at the water. The tide was still flooding, the current setting northeast, the same current that would carry a skilled paddler back around the North Point if they knew how to read it. I thought about Felix saying I should try the south next time, and I thought about the way Ernest had said the second time without explaining what the first time was. I thought about Sarah calling my name from up the path, my place already set, my coffee already poured. I put the phone in my pocket. The sun was warm on my shoulders. The smell of pluff mud and cordgrass drifted across the parking lot, and somewhere in the distance a heron called once, a flat, harsh sound that did not repeat. I got in the car and started the engine. The water was still there when I looked back, flat and open and empty, and I did not know if I would see the island again. I did not know if I wanted to.